Forgive and, what's the first word that came to your mind? Forget. I think that's probably true for almost everyone. Is that biblical?
Yes.
Ish. Yes, ish. And if you'll be patient with me, I'll make that clear in future lessons. Okay? Because we're going to kind of get started on looking at that. In Matthew 18, verses 21 through 22, we see that Peter comes to Jesus with this amazing offer that if his brother sins against him, how many times should he forgive him? Up to 7 times. And just say that. I forgive you. 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 I forgive you.
Keep on being forgiven.
Do your eyes roll by the time they get to the 4th or 5th of those I forgive yous? What if there's never change? What if there's never improvement? I forgive you. I forgive you. I forgive you. And usually we stop there. Such a situation when there's really no change is stressful, both for me and for the other person. It's agonizing for both parties that we would be forgiving each other. And then Jesus comes along and he says, I'm not going to tell you 7 times, but 77 times. And if you're reading different translations, it's 70 times 7, 490, and it's not about the number clearly. Jesus is challenging Peter's concept of what forgiveness is about. And we need that challenge also, because I think we speak of it much too casually. C.S. Lewis wrote in one of his books called Mere Christianity, everyone says forgiveness is a lovely thing until they have something to forgive, as we had during the war. And of course, he's referring to World War II and what the Nazi government had done to London with all the bombings that they had done there. But he's making a really good point about how we struggle with forgiveness. It's always a great thing until I have to forgive you. Is forgiveness hard or easy? It kind of depends on what happens, right? If someone bumps into me hard enough that I fall on the ground and I scrape my knee, is that easy to forgive? If they steal something from me, well, if it's just a pen or a purple folder, if they steal my phone, no, that's pushing it a little bit. I use that thing. What if someone kills someone that I love dearly? Is forgiveness hard, or is forgiveness easy? It also might depend on how close they are to me. I mean, sadly, it's sometimes easier to forgive a stranger than our spouse, or a parent, or a child, if they've said something. Sometimes it's easy to forgive a stranger. One of the popular memes that's on the internet now is this quote by Suzanne Summers, although it's also a tribute to Maya Angelou and Tony Robbins, and I didn't try to trace down where it comes from, but the saying is, forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. It's really common to hear that. That forgiveness essentially is about me. Is that biblical? Is that God's wisdom or man's wisdom that says that? I'm going to suggest to you it's man's wisdom. In fact, a Psychology Today article said this: forgiveness is for your health and well-being, since research shows that holding on to anger is toxic for your health and well-being, and since no one wants to be around those who are chronically angry, bitter, resentful, and unforgiving, then forgiveness is something that you do for you. It is in your best interest to forgive others for their transgressions, not necessarily theirs. You are not engaging in forgiveness to do them a favor, but to do one for yourself. That's kind of scary. But I hear Christians quoting that all the time, or posting it on their social media pages. Let me ask you a question. When God forgives, is he doing it for himself? Certainly not in the sense that psychologist was talking about, right? But he is trying to restore me to a relationship with him. But it's not the selfish idea. One of the songs that I really like has a line in it that says, "The art of forgiveness is not what we're taught." And I think that's really true. When we say things like forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, I love how he uses that expression art. That there's an art to forgiveness. That there's something about it that's not just something that we do, but it's an expression of who we are. And it has to be taught. And today I want to challenge us to look at how God forgives. And so that's where Jesus told Peter the story in Matthew 18. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to. Now, kingdom of heaven is talking about what? Heavenly things, spiritual things. And ultimately, in some cases, even about the church. And so it's about us. This is how God works for us and how ultimately we should work for each other. So this needs to become our reality. How we are to act and to think and to live and to treat others. So the king decides that he's going to call in all of his debts. And he calls in to him a man who owes him 10,000 talents, which is an incredible amount of money that's almost impossible for someone to pay. And the man has nothing. Nothing. So the king says, okay, well, I'm going to sell you, and I'm going to sell your wife, and I'm going to sell your kids, and I'm going to sell everything that you have to pay the debt. If you want a hint at how much this man owed, just think how much it would be if someone sold you, your spouse, your kids, and everything you had. I mean, that's a big amount. The servant falls on his knees. Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. If I was a mean king, which I would be, I would laugh at the guy. In your whole life, you would not be able to pay me back how much you think you can actually pay me back. You couldn't do that and take care of your family and provide the things that you need. But this king is different because he has pity for this man. When that man falls to his knees and says, have patience and I'll do it, there was something in the king that said, great. He is impressed by that. And so he released him of the debt and forgave him the debt. I think in David's translation, it used the word canceled. And that's a lovely word for what we're talking about. He canceled the debt. So let me ask you a question. Should it change this man's life that all of his debt was forgiven? I mean, can you imagine the joy, the elation that he would feel? Because, the burden is gone. You and I feel that sometimes with the mortgage payment, the credit cards, and this bill and that bill. The burden's gone. The guilt is gone. The fear is gone. Someday somebody's going to come ask for payment. Well, that happened. And now it's gone. It's forgiven. What does it mean that the king forgave his servant? That he released it and forgave it? To answer that question, we're actually going to go to the 103rd Psalm. And we're going to look at just the first verses of this psalm, although the psalm is a beautiful picture of what forgiveness is about. Psalm 103, and we're going to read the first 5 verses. This is the Psalm of David. Bless Jehovah, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Bless Jehovah, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits, who forgives all your iniquity and heals all your diseases, who redeems your life from the pit, who crowns you with steadfast love and mercy, who satisfies you with good so that your youth is renewed like the eagles. So here we have this great expression of coming before God and blessing Him, praising Him, and he says, don't forget His benefits. And the word benefits is interesting. We think of it in terms of like a health plan with our job or something like that. But the word here is not just about things that He gives us, but it's how He does things. It's how He deals with us. And so there is a sense in which it's the benefit, but it's showing us how God works. How God works for us. And so don't forget how God is blessing you. Don't forget the things that you receive from Him, the good deeds that He does for you. So, in the psalm, we have a very clear picture of the position that we are in. In verse 3, he says we have iniquity, that is, we've sinned, we've violated God's laws. In verse 3, he says we have diseases. In verse 4, our life is in the pit, which is related to being in death. And that's meant to look like a pit, but I'm not an artist. In verse 10, we have sins and we have iniquities. Verse 12, transgressions. Verse 14, that we are dust. And verse 15, that our days are like grass. So he's really emphasized the problem that we have is our sin. And so what is it that are God's benefits? Well, you notice the first one in verse 3. He forgives all your iniquities. Now, the word forgives here is the idea of something that's canceled, which is why David's translation is really good at this point, that it goes away. Notice, though, he says all. And sometimes we forget that bit. We kind of want to hold on to some of our things that we've done wrong, but he cancels all. Just like that king canceled all the debt of that man. It was completely gone. In verse 12, he amplifies that picture. As far as the east is from the west, so far does he remove our transgressions from us. I mean, they're completely removed from us. But here's the point that I want to make about how God deals with us and what the forgiveness is about. Is that even though the debt at this point is gone, God doesn't stop at forgiveness. And I think that's sometimes what our problem is. Like Peter, we think in terms of how many times do I forgive, and we're kind of counting in our minds whether we admit it or not. Forgiveness is just the beginning of what the Father does for us. God doesn't just leave us where we are, but He provides for us a way that we can go home. How we can restore our broken relationship with Him. And so you'll see in the next verse, he says in verse 3, He heals all your diseases. And we know that sin is sometimes referred to as a disease, as a weakness, as an unsoundness that changes our mind and it changes our view of the world. It weakens us so that we cannot be who God would have us to be. So God knows that we aren't who we should be. We're not healthy. We're not whole. And He heals those diseases. That's an incredible compassion. It's incredible to me because we know how people react to those who are diseased. We see it in the Bible with the lepers, don't we? What was the rule, God's rule, about the leper? They're removed from the rest of society. If they come close, they have to shout. They have to make people know, I'm a leper, I'm a leper. Everyone knows. And if you heard someone shouting along the street, I'm a leper, what do? Turn around and go the other way. You get to the other side of the street. You don't want to be around that person. And here's God. He sees us with sin and all of our diseases, and He heals them all so that we can become what He always intended us to be. In verse 4, we see the next thing that He does. He redeems your life from the pit. The idea of the redeem in this passage has the idea that God is standing up for and vindicating His own people. That He's bringing them back to where they should be. It's the word that's used of a kinsman redeemer in the book of Ruth. That when Boaz was taking care of Ruth and Naomi, he had to bring them back to the right relationship. Here's the point. Our life is in the pit. What does that imply? We're in danger of death. We are in darkness. We're unworthy in some senses of even being brought back. We're hopeless and we're unable to save ourselves, and yet He brings us out of that darkness and into His light. He redeems us. We go from being hopeless to full of hope. He redeems us from the pit. What an incredible picture. The fourth thing, verse 4 also says, He crowned you with steadfast love and mercy. The word crown here can be used either of a crown, or it can be used in the sense of something that surrounds someone. And so I don't know which is best. You can use which illusion you want to. It's easier to do a picture of a crown on a drawing than it is to surround someone. But He crowns us or surrounds us with His steadfast love. That word steadfast love speaks of His covenant love for us, the relationship that we have, that He told God's people about. I will be your God and you will be my people. I'm going to take care of you and you follow after me. I'm surrounded by that. That's a beautiful picture. And then His mercy, compassion, but not just the pity, but the action that restores us to what we should be. So the Father is working to crown us or restore it with us, this full relationship with Him. He doesn't begrudge what He's doing for us. That's why I love the part of the word crown. You know, crown says this is a special honor. But I also like the idea that I'm surrounded by His love and mercy, don't you? This is a beautiful picture of what He has done. Verse 5, He said, He satisfies you with good. Satisfies in this verse means to be filled up, to be completely satiated. You couldn't eat a bite more, would be if this was about food. You couldn't have one more bite. You need nothing. What does that remind you of? Because what it reminds me of is Jehovah's my shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd, Psalm 23, right? Jehovah's my shepherd, I shall not want. Some translations use instead of want, I will lack nothing. Right? And that's the very idea. Satiated, we're full. A few verses down in Psalm 23, what else does He say? You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Runneth over. Yes, King James, right? Yeah. Runneth over. My cup overflows. There's a table there. The table implies a feast. He provides all that for us. My cup overflows. There's plenty more than I can have. This is our God. This is what He's done for us. He satisfies us with good. And again, keep going with this Psalm 23, right? Because He tells us what that good is, why He will never want. In verses 2 and 3, He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. That's the beautiful one. I know there's something nice about the green pastures and the river, but He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. And the psalm, of course, ends with, surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of Jehovah forever. There He is. That's the promise that He's given to us. Kind of makes me think of the prodigal son, too, to satisfy us with good. You know, when the son is left home and he's taken what he's had and he's had his fun and he finds out it's not what he thought it was, and he decides, I'm going to go back home. And he goes back home to his father. This is Luke 15 if you're not sure where it's at, but you know the story. What does he ask his father to do? I'm not worthy to be your son, but let me be a servant. But the father runs to him. And what does he bring to him? a robe, a ring, and the sandals that say, "You are my son." He doesn't accept him back as a servant. He accepts him back as a slave. As a son. And then what? Then the feast. Then they celebrate. Then there's joy when that one has returned. And that's kind of what we see also here in Psalm 103, because he says your youth will be renewed like the eagles. You'll have that strength again. It's like you're young again because you're back where you would be, where you should be. He's taken us from our life is in the pit with diseases and sin and burdened down with that to strength like an eagle's, youth like an eagle's, where we can fly and soar and be all those things he wants us to be. This is how God works, isn't it? And this is how God always has worked for his people. In the book of Joel, and this is just one example, but if you think about God's dealing with the Israelites from the time of Abraham all the way through, you'll see that this is what he's done for his people. In Joel, the 2nd chapter, most of the first part of the 11 verses are about the judgment that's coming. And it's bad. Things are going to be rough. And he warns them of that. And then he says in chapter 2 and in verse 12, "Yet even now, declares Jehovah, return to me with all your heart, with fasting, with weeping, with mourning, and rend your hearts and not your garments. Return to Jehovah your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and he relents over disaster. Who knows whether he will not turn and relent and leave a blessing behind him, a grain offering and drink offering for Jehovah your God. He will turn and relent. He will leave a blessing behind him." Skip down to verse 19. "Jehovah answered and said to his people, Behold, I am sending to you grain, wine, and oil, and you will be satisfied. I will no more make you a reproach among the nations." This is how God works. Not only when we return to him, he blesses us incredibly. And I think, isn't that the whole point? Isn't that the proper response to being forgiven in this way? And not just forgiven, but to be fully restored, is that we're going to, as Psalm 103 says, "Bless Jehovah, O my soul, with all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Bless Jehovah, O my soul." It's so wonderful, we can't help but praise him. So the point of our lesson this morning is this, that forgiveness is only the beginning of a process to restore a broken relationship. If we only forgive, what hope do we provide for the one that we have forgiven? Like Peter, we'll end up counting the times they're forgiven, but no real change happens. And what we see in these verses is that God goes beyond just forgiving. It doesn't just stop there. His job is to reconcile us to himself. This is what forgiveness is about. And this is why forgiveness is so powerful. Our Father is in the business of forgiveness. And he has done it since he has created us. That he has forgiven and forgiven and forgiven. And it's way more than 490 times. It's not just about God is angry and looking for reasons to punish us. How we've misunderstood our Father. And if God is in the business of forgiveness, shouldn't we be in the business of forgiveness? And if we're going to be in the business of forgiveness, isn't it going to be to follow all these same things that he does? Forgive and. I want to change your answer from forgive and forget. Okay? Forgive and, yes, forget the sin. Okay? In a sense, that it's always going to be there, but if you completely forget the sin, don't forget the person. Don't write off the person. Don't become exasperated or irritated by the person. Forgive and heal. and redeem and crown and satisfy. You realize what I've done to you all this morning? I've just made forgiveness harder. Haven't I? I've made it harder because it's not just saying, yeah, you did that to me, but okay, and writing it off. It's saying, yeah, you did that to me, and now I'm going to help you get better. That's what God does for me. He did it for me, and to show the extent of love that he has that made that possible, he sent his son to die so that I could be saved. So that when he forgives me, he doesn't stop there. He heals, he redeems, he crowns, and he satisfies. Praise God that he does that for me. You realize also what this means about that worldly statement? Forgiveness is not about me at all. It's about the one who's wronged, and what can I do to help reconcile us? How can I bring us back together? Now I know as humans, we're limited in our scope in those things. It reminds me of Paul in Romans 12, where he said, as far as it is possible with you, be at peace with all men. I know we have that limitation, but I guess part of what I'm trying to say is, what can I do to bring about that reconciliation? And it needs to go further than just, I forgive you. I forgive you, and I'm going to do what I can to heal you and redeem you and crown you and satisfy you. I'm going to end with one more question. And this is just for thought. And maybe we'll talk about it more later. Does God smile when he forgives me? We want to offer an invitation to anyone here who's not a child of God. He's made it clear what forgiveness is about. He sent his son so that this could be true. If you're in sin, he wants to restore you to a relationship with him, and you can be on your way home. If you have that desire, if you need our prayers and help, come forward as we stand and sing.